to our last session of the day. Today, the session is a suspense panel, Suspicious Minds. And before I introduce the moderator, I just want to remind people that you can get all of our books at great independent bookstores in Ottawa, at places like Perfect Books, Books on Beechwood, The New Spaniel's Tale in Westboro, and at Octopus Books. So I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Liz Angus.
Thank you, Mike. My name is Liz Angus. To tell you a little about myself, I grew up in Alberta, but moved to Ottawa for university, and I've lived in the Toronto and Ottawa areas ever since. I've been writing since I was a child, but for most of my working life, my writing was nonfiction, was business writing. I came back to fiction as I approached retirement, and my suspense novel, Not Your Child, was published this spring by the Wild Rose Press. It features a missing preteen girl, a single mother, and a grandfather with a tragic backstory. And here's the picture of the book. So I'd like to welcome our panelists to this panel. It's called, the name of the panel is Suspicious Minds, which really serves as an umbrella term for a diverse panel. Includes two writers of mystery fiction, Max Folsom and Madonna Scaff, and a true crime writer, John Hill. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'll be asking them a number of questions that should bring you further insight into their books and their writing. Later in the session, we'll have time for questions from the audience, and I encourage everyone attending to insert questions, which you have to put in the Q&A section of your screen down at the bottom, not the chat section. So to start, I would like to ask each of the speakers to tell us a little bit about themselves, and let's start with Max.
Oh my, when you get to be my age, that could be a long story. I was born in the States and moved to Canada in 1961. So I consider myself mostly Canadian. We live in Ottawa, in Centertown, and we have a second home in Vermont. So I go back and forth quite a bit. I'm married to a retired Canadian military officer, and we have a cat. I drive a Mini like my protagonist, and that's about it.
Okay, John, could you tell us about a bit about your life, your background, and how you came to writing?
Well, I grew up in a little town that previous writers would call a cozy environment, and left that to go to university. I was the first in my family to ever get to university, and I stayed on for 4 degrees, and then ended up teaching at the Queen's Law School and at the University of Windsor. But my true love was private practice, and I developed a passion for prison law. And as a result, I got to meet a lot of Canada's most notorious criminals. And I also became a prison law reformer and took a number of cases to court. And my book is about, the main story is about one of those cases. And then there's a bunch of other stories about some very famous criminals that you may have read about, and this is my interaction with them.
Very good. And Madonna, let's hear a little bit about you.
I live in Ottawa all my life with my husband, and my daughter is only about 10 minutes away, so we can drop in whenever. As I guess like a lot of writers, I started writing or telling stories even before I knew how to write, and I was just telling stories to the neighborhood kids. And of course, later I started sending in short stories and novels, and my dream was to be a published author of novels. So mostly short stories got accepted, and which was great. And they were both in, I started out science fiction and mystery. And actually my recent short story is a supernatural thriller, I guess. It's in the spirit of 13. It's from the Madames of Mayhem. And it's the story is called Moving On. It's about a psychic who discovers he actually wasn't a scammer after all. So he now helps ghosts discover who killed them. And for the books, I'm the author of the Nye Investigates series. It's about a young woman who is disabled by MS and then turns sleuth to solve crimes. And I've also written a standalone high-tech thriller called Shifting Trust. So.
All right, and so we heard from all three of you now. John, you started to tell us about your book. I wonder if you could tell us a little more. What's it about? And although it's true crime, I believe it probably has a storyline. You said it's a notorious case. So maybe you could tell us a bit about it.
Well, that's the book, Pine Box Parole. The main story is about Terry Fitzsimmons, who was released from solitary confinement after spending 6 years in there. He was released directly to the street. He hid out in Toronto's gay community, breaching his parole, and met up with another fellow who was dying of AIDS by the name of Don Hebert. And the two of them took off on a drug-fueled rampage of bank robbery and murder, with murders happening in Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. Terry turned himself into police, made a complete confession, and then asked to have legal representation. So the story is not a whodunit, but the main storyline is about why he did it. And I had a bit of a problem when I first submitted it. I submitted the story of Terry. I thought that was good, but I got a letter back from a publisher saying, well, it is publishable, but I think the story would be much improved if you told us about your personal involvement in it. So I went back to the keyboard and revised the manuscript to add myself as a character. And so there's actually two storylines in it. The storyline of Terry and his involvement and why he got involved, and also what it's like to defend somebody you know is guilty. So there's those two things meshed together in the main story.
That sounds fascinating. I can't wait to read it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So yes, it sounds like there's more plot there than a lot of mystery novels, a lot of fictional novels.
Well, it's all true. So I didn't have to use my imagination like most of you writers do. I was very impressed all day long listening about how creative you all are. But my facts were there. It was set out before me, and I didn't have to make anything up. What was difficult, though, was because lawyers are trained to have boundaries. You are not to allow yourself to get caught up in your client's situation. So when I started writing this, I had to breach all my training and insert my own emotions into what I was hearing. And this was, on the one hand, it was very liberating, but on the other hand, it was very difficult.
Let's move on to Max. Max, you have a 2-book series. You have a private investigator who you said drives a Mini. Tell us a little more about your character in the book.
Well, the protagonist is a woman named Baker Somerset, and she was a missing persons detective for Scotland Yard in England. And they had a case that where the suspects had gone to Ottawa. And so she got seconded to the Ottawa Police Service to work on that case. This all takes place before the book starts. And taking down in one of the police actions, she was shot 4 times. And so she spent quite a bit of time in hospital and recovering. And when she got out, she decided to stay in Ottawa and open a private detective agency. So she has a police background and but is now a private detective. So she solves mysteries for a living. She's not an amateur by any stretch of the imagination. And one of her problems that she's often in conflict between how she had to do something as a police officer and the little bit of freedom that she wants to exercise as a private detective. And she's always thinking, well, I couldn't do this if I was still a policeman. Maybe I shouldn't do it now, but she, so she's, I met her in one of those visual scenes that you get in your head. And I saw the opening scene to the first book, which was called One Bad Day After Another. And she doesn't have a lot of hangups. She's not fighting alcohol or drugs. She's not a single mom. She doesn't have those kind of issues, but she still has issues about getting shot. And in the first book, she actually has to retell that episode of her life. And so you get a glimpse into that. And in the second one, in the second book, which is the new book, it's called Searching for Peter Griffiths. She says her office's, her detective agency is called Case Closed Investigations. And she said the main object of the agency is to, of course, solve the crime. The second object is stay alive while you do it. And then she adds under her breath, she seems to be taking more time doing the second than the first. And she also has a flashback in the second book. So that is a thing, but she has two wonderful sidekicks who are, I guess you would say, amateurs. They both have other jobs. One is a Jamaican woman who works at the British High Commission. She is their chief computer guru. And so she's a real computer whiz. Baker Somerset is a Luddite. She hates a computer. She can barely do email. But her friend, who they call Keys, is a whiz. So because no detective could get by in this day and age without a computer. So Keys is her computer. And her other friend is named Joe Manning, who was an expat who grew up in Singapore and is a martial arts expert. And the two of them kind of have a close relationship with Somerset and help her out.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to each of you, but I'm skipping around. I want to give the audience a flavor of each of your books, and then we'll move into them in a little more depth. So Madonna, tell us about now I know that you write both science fiction and mystery, and your most recent book is a science fiction book, but I'm hoping you'll tell us about your mystery series in particular. So tell us about that, what you want to say.
Well, I'll start with the most recent book, which is Shifting Trust. And I just have to, brag, because my daughter, Louise Corin, did the artwork for that. And it was it's a science fiction, but it's only set about 25 years into the future. It's set in Ottawa and England. And Tyler Demir left the RCMP with PTSD. And so for 10 years, he's been really comfortable working as security in an underground installation, a nanotech company funded by the military, so top secret. And everything's going fine. He's not in charge of any lives until a scientist is kidnapped, has to go after him. So that's sort of the short version of this. And so I'm also the author of the Naya Investigates series. And the first book in the series is Journey of 1,000 Steps. And in this one, you meet Naya, who's a computer genius, and she runs marathons in her spare time. And the book opens with her running the Ottawa Marathon, and she collapses about 5 kilometers from the end, stricken by an unexpected MS attack. And so she's sort of temporarily paralyzed, but as she's recovering, a friend of hers is kidnapped. And so she tries to get the police to go look for her friend, but circumstances, they don't quite believe anything's really wrong. So she decides to take off on her own, and she's going to search for her friend. And unfortunately, she winds up following a convoluted path of, which leads her to like drug dealers and, smugglers and things, and have guns pointed at her, and there's big car chases. So and I won't tell you how it ends, but that's kind of like par for the course. And so in the second book, it was, it takes place just a few months after. It's called Death by Association. And this was actually published in the spring of 2020. So, so in this book, she's a little bit frustrated because her recovery, like she went really far from, going from a wheelchair to using a cane to only occasionally using a cane, but she found that her strength isn't quite there. And so she's at the gym working out, and there's this man that comes in, and, every time she's there, he seems to show up, and he's in a wheelchair. I should mention that. And so he's got too many prying questions, but fortunately she's saved from all his questions when a SWAT team sweeps in and arrests him for 3 counts of murder. And so she thinks, oh, well, that was a close call. He might have been grooming her for victim number 4. And so she goes home thinking, oh, this is over, just gonna put it behind her, no more sleuthing. And then she gets a call from the man from prison asking for help. And despite herself, she winds up getting dragged in to investigate a serial killer, or to try and find a serial killer who is also watching her and has made a few attempts on her life. And just to let you know too, in the second book, I decided to give her a dog. And when my daughter asks, well, why? Says, well, because she needs a dog. And so anyways, the dog, of course, wound up sometimes stealing a few scenes, but we kept him under control. So.
Yes, my book has a dog too.
So does mine.
So I want to go back to each of you and have you tell us what brought you to write that particular book. There are many possible topics, plots, themes that you could have addressed. John, let's start with you. I believe you write a regular column on legal issues. And so you probably have many, many topics you could have written about. What made you write this and write a book like, whatever you call it, project?
Pine Box Pearl.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I do write calmly 1 or 2 a week for the Lawyers Daily, dealing with criminal matters and sometimes prison matters. But what really started this out was about 3 years ago. I was at a law school reunion, and we were sitting around a table, and I was telling some of my prison stories to my former classmates. And one of them said, you should write this down. And so I took his advice. So I came back and started pounding away, and then going through the usual process of submitting it to publishers and so forth. So I was actually quite surprised to have a publisher phone me up and say, yeah, we want to put this out in 2022. But it's not a tell-all story, in that Terry wanted his story told. So I'm not disclosing any solicitor-client privileged material. This is what he told me. It was all revealed in open court at the time, but of course nobody follows the court trials, and so I got to put it down in paper, and I'm quite surprised the number of people that had never heard the story before and were actually quite taken by it. The reason I did it, of course, was because I'm a prison reformer, and I wanted to bring out the facts that solitary confinement is such a dreadful existence. So that gave me that opportunity to push that end. I was able to tell Terry's story the way he wanted it told. So everything sort of melded together.
Very good. Max, what brought you to your story? And was there some personal experiences that you drew on, or what was it that brought you to that story?
Well, as I said, for the first book, the opening scene of the book just appeared to me like a movie. And I'd never dreamed of being a writer. I'm not like all the other writers today who said I knew when I was 4 years old I wanted to be a writer. But I told my husband, I saw this scene, and he goes, well, what happened? And I go, I don't know. And he said, well, write it down and find out. So I did. And as I went along, the story just moved in a certain way. And perhaps because of my husband's military background and things I had heard people talking about, the subplot of the first book became illegal activity in the arms and military equipment industry, bribery and murder and a lot of other stuff. And I got to be a little bit afraid. I thinking, should I be writing this? So I gave the book to some of people we knew, and they all came back, and none of them said, yes, this is right. None of them said anything. They just said, keep writing. So I did. And then partway through that book, Somerset gets a phone call from the insurance company saying, we want you to work a case for us. They didn't say what it was, but there was my second book. And I went to that, and it involved a young man who disappears from Parliament Hill, just vanishes. And he's carrying a secret file, not a secret file, a sensitive file. And it turned out that I had recently become aware of the human rights issue regarding the island of Diego Garcia, which has one of the biggest United States military bases outside the US. And what happened was Britain and the United States made a secret treaty to give the United States that island and removed all the islanders from their homes. So that became a consuming interest for me for a while. And so it becomes a background subplot in that book. And so each of her books has like multiple, there's probably the initial crime, and then there's a crime that happens because of it, but then there's a subplot that involves a real live history or event or issue that is only possible because she's in Ottawa. She was in Winnipeg, this probably wouldn't be of concern to her, but because she's in the capital. Yeah. And the third book winds up that way too. It has an issue as well.
Very good. What about you, Madonna?
Well, I guess
how you came to your series character, and also I'm intrigued by what you called your science fiction book, but I think it's given that it's so in our near future and its plot sounds so much like a normal mystery crime story, just set a little bit in the future. What brought you to all those stories?
Well, for the science fiction one, I'll tell you, it started out being just a regular mystery thriller, an international thing, but I'm using high tech in there. And so this was, I won't say how long ago I wrote it. And so I would always confirm that the tech, because I needed the tech to be cutting edge or like just ahead of what we can do. So I finished this stupid book and I thought, no, let me just check, because 2 months ago I checked and they don't do this thing yet. So I checked. And I worked in research, so I had access to all these journals, scientific journals, and sure enough, they had just developed this thing. And I'm thinking, so I left it. I mean, I sent it out a lot, it got rejected, and then I left it. And then just a couple of years ago, I started thinking, well, you know what? Maybe just trying to turn this into a science fiction, go 25 years into the future. So it is basically a mystery, and it's a thriller. It's a lot. Anybody who's read my Naya books, there's more. There's more violence. It's a little bit more swearing and things in this book. So be forewarned. But for the series, though, I guess that was kind of a bit of a long story because I was saying I'd always dreamed of being a writer. And Max, sorry, but when I was a kid, I wanted to go to the moon, and and write a book. So I was just like, that's all I ever wanted to do.
That's
And then
okay.
yeah, it's okay, you know. So, but I started like when I got older and I could write actually. So it was actually not until after university when I had the time, I started submitting everything, and short stories are getting published, sort of. You know, my favorite is one place where they wouldn't give me an author's copy; they offered me a discount. So it was small press. Let's put it that way. And the novels, just like I was sending them out. I wrote several. I wrote different types, and nobody seemed to like it. And so then I started thinking about, people keep saying, well, write what you know. I mean, it's sort of silly when you think about it. I write science fiction, you know, so I haven't been to other planets. I don't think I'm an alien, and I don't think you guys are aliens. But then I started thinking maybe I should try that, because nothing else has worked. I've been writing for years, and you know, got a nice file cabinet full of manuscripts. And so, you know, I thought I'd draw on my own experiences. So several years ago, I was diagnosed myself with MS, with multiple sclerosis. And you know, I'd been always pretty active. Like, I'm certainly not an athlete. And, but I rode my 10 speed everywhere. I went to the gym, you know, a couple of times a week. And, you know, I was into some, you know, I had tried fencing and things like that. So I was active. And then but then I started getting back problems. I'm thinking, well, this is sort of weird, like nothing seems to be working. Eventually they came down with the diagnosis that it was MS. And so after that, I decided that's it. I'm going to indulge in self-pity for an entire day. And it's because, like, well, my stubborn streak kind of helped. And so with a few minor adjustments, you know, I was, because my mobility was changing, I had to use a cane, and longer distances, you know, I'd get tired easily. So, but anyways, like just with a few little modifications, I was able to pick up my life where I left it. And it hadn't been, you know, changed a little bit, but not destroyed. And so then I started thinking, well, you know what about if you have an amateur sleuth who has MS? And so I was able to draw on my experiences with, you know, the feelings and also things that happened. And like in the book, she's sent to the rehab center and for rehabilitation. And so I drew on some of my experiences there. And I mean, some of the stuff I changed. So if there's a kind of a nasty person in there. No, she didn't really exist. I just invented her. So don't go to the rehab center and yell at everybody. But you know, so I was thinking of all this, and then the character started taking form, and then Naya was born. So, you know, and I haven't actually looked back, so. Oh, that's
Well,
it.
that's a nice segue into my next question, which is, can you just tell us a little bit more about your Naya, your main character, and what attracted you to her? I guess a great deal of it was that you created her out of your own experience, but creating an experience, a character, is more than just writing down what you yourself know. So you then created. What attracted you to that creation?
Well, I mean, I think actually, I'm going to talk about both characters, like Naya, and from the Naya Investigate series, and also Tyler. He's from the Shifting Trust, the science fiction book. They both sort of coming from, I don't know, I guess like an injured place. You know, they were maybe normal at one point, and then something happened to each of them. And for example, Naya, as I said, she goes from being an athlete, because I mean, running a marathon is not just like, oh, that's just something you do on a weekend once in a while. And so she goes from an athlete to being somebody who is basically really limited in mobility, and she has to adjust to all these things. And the same thing for Tyler, like he left the RCMP with PTSD because he was in charge of that undercover operation, and several people, both sides, you know, the criminals and officers were killed. And so for him, you know, he just can't make decisions, doesn't want to be in charge. And so for 10 years, he was basically hiding out. And when Naya first was recovering, she was refusing to go out of the house because she didn't want anybody to see how she looked. And so a little bit of that is sort of, well, with myself, I mean, I missed several Capital Crime Writer meetings, and because I just didn't want to go out, like here I am and it's such a walk from the parking lot, I would have to use the walker. I couldn't take just the cane. And so my husband, bless his heart, says, you just go, get out, like leave. It's not going to kill you. Like, so what? And so I went there and nobody was like, oh my God, she's using walkers. And so I thought, oh, okay. And so that was sort of a very like aha moment. And I put that in her character, in Naya's character as well. But I think basically both of them seem to like they have something they have to do. Like in the first book, she needs to find her friend. In the second book, she needs to find the serial killer because turning into a desperate act, the serial killer is turning desperate. And for Tyler himself as well, he needs to go find the scientists, and things don't seem to be normal. So they wind up basically going further than what they thought they could, like what their what their abilities were. And I think I've always been kind of attracted to characters that are basically ordinary humans like you or me, and then something happens and then they wind up having to do, like it forces them to do something more, like not necessarily heroic, but go on beyond their abilities. So it's I guess that's sort of most of my characters tend to be like that, I think.
Let me turn that question to you, Max. What attracted you to the character that is your main person, your investigator?
Well, first I want to say that Shifting Trust was terrible. I started reading it in the evening, and at 2:30 in the morning, I was still turning the pages.
Oh,
And I have read probably 200 books a year before I started writing them, 90% of them mysteries. And I got to the end, and I can truthfully say, I did not see that coming.
oh, thank you so much. You had me worried there for a second. I was just gonna, oops, I fell down. Oh, thank you so much.
What I like about Somerset is that she's had a trauma, but she's sort of the old school. You just put one foot in front of the other. She's deeply committed to her friends and to her case. She wants to bring justice. She wants to get the truth of the matter. And so far in both books, a point has come up where she had the opportunity to quit, to turn back, to drop it, to let the police do it. And she couldn't. She owed too much to the people who had been hurt or murdered or whatever, and she makes the decision to keep going. A lot of people who have read her say, I like that she doesn't have 800 issues because I got enough issues in my own life. I don't need to read about anymore. But yeah, I just like her because she's a person that I'm friends with. As soon as I saw her in that first image, I knew her. I don't have to ask what would she do, because I know her and she's like a friend. If I could take a fictional character and say, you're my friend. Yeah.
Well, it's nice you like your character, and it's good to be friends with them.
I love her. And in the second book, Searching for Peter Griffiths, something happens that is really close to home, and she's terrified and she's hurt. And I started crying. When I reached that point in the book, I was sitting there typing and I couldn't see the keys because I was crying. I'm going like, this can't happen to them. And yeah, they're like my family.
Well, John, you didn't make up your character. You had your character come to you, and you mentioned you were telling his story. I'm not sure you wanted to tell his story, but I'm not sure that he's somebody you've liked. So why did you want to tell his story?
Well, the fact of the matter is, most people think of murderers as some sort of Frankenstein monster. And yet, in my job as defending criminals like this, I get to know these people quite intimately. They are people that you'd meet at the grocery store, by and large. They're very rounded human beings. And when I started telling the story of Terry, here's a guy who ended up, in the end, murdering 4 people. And yet he was a humorous guy. He was very pleasant, very polite, somebody that you'd probably like to know. And this is a very different perception of people, and a different perception of inmates, because a lot of people think, oh, these are really bad people. Let's do everything we can to make life miserable. Whereas in my profession, my job is to make sure that the laws are obeyed and that they are treated humanely. And so one of the parts of, now that I'm retired, I got to do in writing this book is to paint a picture of a whole person, not just the evil that he did, but the whole person behind him. And some of the people who have read the book say they actually felt sorry for him.
Well, let me turn to another topic. I'm wondering, each of you can tell us, are you working on another book? So Max, let's start with you. Do you have a third one in your series going? I think you mentioned something to that effect.
Yes, the third book, I'm on chapter 8. I think I'm more of a pantser than a plotter, although I kind of know where I kind of want to go, but I never know how I'm going to get there. The third book will be called Death of a Code Breaker.
Oh, wow.
And it involves a young woman who has gone missing, because missing persons is Baker's specialty, even though often murder is involved. Involves a young woman who's gone missing, who came to Ottawa to work because her ancestor, her great-grandmother's sister, came to Ottawa to work during World War II and disappeared, and no one has any idea what happened to her. And we learned that she actually worked at the examination unit, which was on Laurier Street, where the code breakers in Ottawa worked with the code breakers in Bletchley Park.
Oh,
And I visited Bletchley Park
yeah.
When I was in England. And so I was really surprised to learn that Ottawa had its own Bletchley Park, its own unit. And I met some people in the Ottawa Historical Society who told me more about it. And it just became really, really interesting. And then, of course, I found out about the German weather station up in Labrador and the submarines that entered the St. Lawrence Seaway. So I'm off and running, and I've got World War II off in the distance, because I've got this ancestor who also disappeared. But how do you link up her, the present girl, with someone from 50 years ago or 60 years ago or whatever? And at one point, Baker's just stumped, just absolutely blocked. And she says, I don't know how to, or Keith says to her, how are you going to find this out? And she says, I don't know. Because I was up against a wall and I didn't know either. And I thought, well, maybe she knows. So Keith asked her, she didn't know either. And I thought, oh, I'm really in trouble now. But it turned out that Keith had a suggestion. So anyway, so it's going to involve code breakers, spies, Ottawa, World War II.
Fascinating. Okay. So Madonna, do you have another one in your back pocket?
Well, I have a few ideas for other kinds of books, and I wasn't really planning to write another Naya Investigates story, but it was our 25th anniversary a couple of years ago. So my husband and I rented a cottage for a week in Prince Edward County. And I had kind of I don't know, I dropped my guard or something, and then I got a story idea. And no matter how much I struggled, it took form. And I was kind of stuck. So I mean, I have to write book 3. And it's actually, this time it's going to be, she's looking at a 40-year-old cold case, a disappearance of 2 people in Prince Edward County. And of course, as usual, the case will end up putting herself and all her friends in danger, because otherwise it wouldn't be much fun. And just to let you know, I just did finish the first draft.
Oh, very good.
And so, you know.
Now I see Mike has joined us, so I guess we have some questions from the audience. So let's hear what questions we have.
That is correct. So the first question is for Madonna. Madonna, are you a computer geek? I.e., did you write what you know? If not, how did you give authenticity to that part of the story?
Well, I know enough about computers to get into trouble. And I know my daughter is always teasing me. She says, why would you make her a computer expert? And I said, well, you know, I aspire. But no, I mean, like I can make the computer work, and I can actually, you know, download stuff. But no, I'm no way a geek. And I did a lot of research, and I have friends who are geeks, so they helped.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I have a question for John. John, what process did you have to follow to be able to write the book, being it involves a real person? Are the release forms that the subject of your book had to sign? Did you have to share
No.
profits? Did you have to share profits with the person that you wrote the book about?
No, well, the main story is about Terry Fitzsimmons, and if you read the story, just about everybody in it is dead now. No, most of the stories that involve living people are all drawn out of court records or newspaper articles. It's all public domain. So it's the story that's there. It's out there and drawn together. There's no going into their personal life and personal stories that no one else knows. This is all material that's gathered together, but it tells the whole story.
So you get to keep all the millions you're making to yourself.
Or what I might have to repay after they do up the book sales.
Yeah. So this is a question maybe both Liz and Max can answer is, what is the key ingredient to create suspense based on your writing journey to date?
Max?
I think the protagonist always has something to lose. Whether for Baker, she could lose her detective license, which would crush her because she's not a police person anymore. And being a detective is what she is. So she could lose that. She could lose her life. She could lose her friends. She could disappoint her father. There's all of these things, and in each step, the price gets bigger. As you go along, the price that she might have to pay is increased. And you kind of think you maybe are getting there when you start getting scared for her. At least that's how I judge it. When I'm going like, oh, then I think maybe we're there.
I think you asked me that question too, Mike. And I would say, first of all, you have to care about the characters. You have to make your readers care. And then you have to make them dread that something is terrible is going to happen to them. And that's the suspense.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. So I got a question for everybody, and maybe start with John, because you're maybe the newest person in this system. So the question is, if you were to start all over today, what would you do differently with your writing career?
I'm new to it, so I didn't know anything, and I'm learning an awful lot. Writing is actually the easy part. I found that the editing, the promotion, like I had to do an interview on CBC on Wednesday.
Sure.
I've got to do book signings and so forth. And then most people want to know, ask questions about prisons and what it's like and what my experiences are and so forth. And just to be able to give, I can never prepare a speech and say, this is what it's about. I have to be flow freely to satisfy my audience.
Thank you, John. Liz,
What was the question?
so the question is, if you were to start all over today,
Oh, yes, my writing
what-
career.
what would you do differently?
I think I would start earlier. I actually started writing fiction about 20 years ago, and then somehow I dropped it. There were other things in my life that kept me very involved. I don't regret any of those things, but you know, that's 20 years that if I had been plowing ahead with my first novel at that point, you know, I might have 8 or 10 out now. I'm always running into best-selling novelists who got their first novel out in, you know, 2012. I think that was 12 years after I started writing fiction, but I sort of dropped it in the meantime. So, you know, you only have one life. As I say, I don't regret anything I did in the between, but you know, I'm now at a stage where I don't have all those, I've lost those 20 years if I were to have them in my writing life.
Thank you, Liz. Max?
Well, like Liz, I don't regret anything that's happened in the years before. But if I had known I was going to become a writer, I would like to have started earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you,
I guess I was just sort of, I started earlier, but I wasn't very consistent, and I'm kind of not necessarily lazy, but you know, I should have submitted more. And like, I'm really good at, if you give me a deadline, I can meet it. But if I give myself a deadline, like I'm easily bribed. Like, I mean, I'm planning to finish draft 2 before Christmas, but I think I see a chocolate cake with my name on it. So I'm sure it won't be then. But yeah, I think I would have been a little bit more strict with myself. Because like I did the same as you and Liz, like I started sending out stuff, didn't get published, so I'd sort of take a break, you know, and next thing you know, a couple of years have gone by. So it wasn't until 2015 that I got my first novel published. So I should have been more persistent. So all you writers out there, just keep sending stuff out and don't be lazy.
Mike, can I break in with one final question? I promised my panelists this would be the final question that I would ask, and that is, where can readers find your books? So start with John.
Well, it's local bookstores, Indigo chapters. If you go online, they can promise immediate delivery online, and of course Amazon have it to you the next day. So.
Right. Okay. Madonna.
Okay, well, same thing, local bookstores. It's a small press publisher, but they've made some kind of agreement now with distributors, so it doesn't cost an arm and a leg if you order the book. So go to your little independent bookstore, your favorite store, also from Amazon, and I guess if you went right to the publisher, Renaissance Press. So, yeah.
Max.
Yeah, it's the same for me. Independent bookstores, if they don't have it on the shelf, can certainly get it almost immediately. Amazon has it listed. I know some people who have gotten it already from them and the publisher, which was Friesen Press.
Okay.
And there's a link to Friesen on my website, which is maxfolsom.com.
Very good. So do we have any more questions, Mike?
No, that's it for the questions. So I leave it to you to close this session, and I have a few closing conference comments. So over to you, Liz.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank my panelists. Thank you, Max, John, and Madonna. Thank you also to Writers First and the Maple Leaf Conference Committee for their work in putting on this wonderful conference today. And I'd like to also thank all the attendees for spending the time with us today.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. And just to close off our day, thank you, everybody, for a great day of mystery crime writing. And just a reminder that you can get your books at local independent bookstores in Ottawa, Perfect Books, Books on Beechwood, the new Spaniard's Tale in Westboro. And thank you, everybody who participated as a moderator, as a panelist, and we'll see you again real soon for Maple Leaf Mystery. Thank you.